Welcome to another episode of Litigious, the number one podcast on the internet for discussions of legal stories in the news and their implications. I'm Scott Peterson. Giovanna's here with me today. Before we get started, just a reminder, if you like this show, please follow, like it, subscribe, share it with friends, do all the things that you do to spread the word on good podcasts. This show is brought to you by DeRazio Peterson, a employment and serious injury law firm in New York. If you have questions about any legal issues, reach out to us at DeRazioPeterson.com or hit us up on Instagram at DeRazioPeterson. If you have questions for the show, hit us up at Litigious on Instagram. So we're back after a little bit of a break, and we will be more consistently recording moving forward. So buckle up because there's a lot going on, and we have a lot to talk about today. And we jumped around. We're going to move something to the top because the big story in the news as it relates to legal claims this week is the firing of the head football coach at the University of Michigan, who was terminated this week following reports of allegations relating to an allegedly inappropriate relationship with a subordinate. Before we get into the story, just for background, the University of Michigan, I'm a huge Michigan sports fan. I grew up loving Michigan basketball from the early days of what basketball fans would remember as the Fab Five on their basketball program. So I've been following Michigan sports for 30 years. Michigan won a national championship a couple of years ago. It was sort of clouded by some scandal. Their head coach at the time ended up leaving the program for an NFL job, and their current coach was then brought on to sort of, I don't know, bring the program back to its glory. And Sharon Moore, unfortunately, his tenure has ended in a bit of a problem. So why don't you fill us in on what's going on here? And then there's been a breaking kind of piece to this morning that I think we should talk about.
Well, the school was pretty clear on why they fired him. They said he was terminated for cause or with cause for having an inappropriate relationship with a staff member. So I think there's sort of multiple kind of legal implications of that statement. The with cause is probably to get them out of whatever employment agreement that I'm sure that he had. I think they said he was making over $5 million a year. So typically, if you have an employment agreement, a lot of times if you're let go without cause, there would be some kind of provision in there for you to get separation pay or some kind of payout or something like that. But usually there's an out for the employer. So if you're terminated with cause, that's it. You're gone. They don't have to follow any procedures. You don't get any severance pay or anything like that. So I think it sounds like they have definitely decided to take kind of a hard line on why he was fired and not give him like a little golden parachute, like I think many people get in these types of situations. I'll let you
Yeah,
jump.
and yeah, well, I was just going to say he was earning 6.1 million this year, and you are 100% right. This happened recently with a big high profile coach. It's very routine in college football in particular that when coaches exit, they receive massive payouts if they leave before their contracts end, and they almost all have contracts. I would guarantee he does, and I think you're exactly right. That's why they framed it the way that they did. There's an interesting story this or piece this morning that apparently, and I think this is one of the issues to talk about, is there's an allegation now that he had notified the university earlier this week that he was dealing with mental health issues, and that the AD, just athletic director, despite knowing that, fired him anyway in a one-on-one meeting without the presence of HR, which raises potentially some issues, which you can talk about. And you can also talk about why those issues may not matter.
Okay, so I didn't know that. So yeah,
Yeah, that just came out.
that raises a whole host of other issues too. But yeah, so I guess we could, do you want to talk about that first before we talk about the inappropriate relationship with the staff member?
Well, I think you can probably talk about them as one because talk about the inappropriate relationship issue and then why someone raising a mental health issue can sometimes get them a protection, but why in this case it probably won't.
Okay. So most companies have, or especially large companies, have anti-fraternization policies. And we talked about this a lot in the Coldplay situation when, the CEO of Astronomer was found with the head of HR and he ended up resigning. Ultimately, we're not really quite sure how that all shook out in terms of whether they were actually having an affair or not. But ultimately, we talked about the fact that this is how people get themselves in trouble when they have relationships in the workplace because you have these policies. And the reason for the policy is to avoid a situation where a subordinate may feel coerced into having a quid pro quo kind of romantic relationship with somebody in a position of power. And, because when that happens, you have a million problems. And this Michigan situation is a very obvious example of what happens when people violate these policies because this guy has destroyed his life, putting aside his own personal family ramifications from this, but it gave the organization an out of his contract. And it's just very sort of messy when these things blow up. And I did see this morning, anytime something happens in the news, like you're going to get all these people kind of having a conversation about it, ourselves included. And I saw one today that was sort of like, the woman who he had the affair with also deserves to be fired because she also broke the rules. And I was actually sort of like thought it was positive to see that most of the comments were like, not if she was his subordinate, because then they have an inherent imbalance of power. And, whether we like it or not, that is true. And that's why these policies exist. So, yes, can we wrap our minds around the fact intellectually that you can have a potentially consenting relationship between two people at different levels in a company? Yes, but there are people who are exercising their, common sense and their, making intelligent choices who will, and I actually know people who have done this, where one person will leave the company. If you want to have that relationship and it's a consenting relationship, people will, now this is different, you're having an affair, but there are ways to navigate that. A lot of those, you're laughing, a lot of those policies also have you can go to HR and disclose the relationship and get like a stamp of approval on it. Now, yes, again, when you're having an affair, that you're like outside the bounds of doing things the right way.
Yeah, let's not kid ourselves here. This guy, he was the head football coach of a major university, one step away from the NFL. He's married with kids, and he's allegedly having an affair with his executive assistant. This is not the kind of relationship that you go to HR and say, "I'm leaving my wife. I'm going to blow up my entire life, and we're just going to live happily ever after." Like that's no chance. And to your point, yes, there are plenty of situations I think where consensual relationships happen and maybe they're both violating the policy, but from an employment law perspective, it would be probably pretty foolish for the university to fire her at this point, because she
Yeah,
probably
and
has
I
a pretty good claim of quid pro quo retaliation.
Yeah, and it's a cautionary tale for people that are in these sort of higher up positions. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of people seem to not be able to help themselves, but same thing with the astronomer CEO. Like, if you're in the higher level position, you have to understand that you are the one who is going to bear the brunt of the consequences of this, whether you like it or not. And, we kind of had this conversation recently because we were watching that show, The Beast in Me, and there was a conversation in that show about like sort of releasing like the dark thoughts, like you're standing on the edge of a cliff and like you don't jump off of it. And this is one of those situations where, ideally, if you're in this position of authority and you have these, what dark thoughts about pursuing something with somebody who's a subordinate to you, you have to kind of like let it flow through your brain and release it because you are the one who's going down when this blows up, which probably will.
For those Quentin Tarantino fans out there, there's a great scene in Pulp Fiction where John Travolta's character has those dark thoughts about the spouse of his mob boss, the spouse played by Uma Thurman, and he has a whole scene which is not appropriate for a podcast, but relates to exactly that scenario where he's tempted, but he decides not to do it.
Yeah, just
Um,
let it go.
yeah,
Not worth it. Not worth it.
yeah.
But yeah, you want
But yeah, let's get into so let's assume for the sake of argument that the university comes into information that this relationship is happening. They make the decision that they're going to fire him. He comes to them and says, I need help. I'm having mental health issues. I'm in a mental health crisis right now, which arguably, depending upon the circumstances, rises to the level of a disability. What does that do in terms of his legal rights and protections? And then why, in this case, does it probably not matter?
yeah, this issue is a little bit dicey. I think that we are starting to see this a little bit more, and I actually just saw, do you know who Liz Plank is?
No.
She actually used to host a podcast with Justin Baldoni, one of our frequent topics of conversation with the Blake Lively thing. But she is, a thoughtful sort of commentator. She's like a lot of talking head stuff. She has her own podcasts and Instagram, and she's, sort of a thoughtful but also kind of celebrity speaker about like feminism and sort of toxic masculinity, but not in necessarily what I would consider to be like a male bashing way, but more in a like we can do better than this. Like there's a lot of like good guys out there, and like we can hold you guys to like a higher standard. And she just had an article about this that I thought was interesting about how a lot of men in positions of power right now have been excusing bad behavior by claims of like neurodivergent diagnoses like Asperger's or something like that. Or like we've seen Kanye West use his mental health issues as an excuse for hateful language. We've seen Elon Musk do this. There was the guy from, what is that, Palantir? What is it called?
Volunteer.
Palantir. He just did this the other day. He just had like a kind of public sort of
Yeah,
tantrum,
I
blamed
think it
it
was
on.
at the New York Times forum. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is just a roundabout way of saying that I have started to see this as becoming more prevalent as well when we get some phone calls about people who are employed who have done something very inappropriate in the workplace and have said, this is because of my fill in the blank diagnosis that I did this. So I don't know if this was a calculated move on this guy's part that he said, this is all about to blow up, so let me go in there and try to protect my job in some way. It may not have been as calculated as that. Perhaps he has started to go through some sort of crisis because of his own actions. He has blown up his entire family life and career. And now is like, oh, maybe I need to take some, FMLA time and go to, rehab or, sort myself out or whatever. So in a vacuum is going to your employer and disclosing a mental health problem and requesting potentially some kind of accommodation or some type of medical leave. Yes, can that sometimes protect your job or entitle you to some sort of leave? Yes. That being said, there is plenty of case law on the books that a disability cannot be used to excuse misconduct, because you're kind of breaking the causation chain of why was I fired. When you have any employment discrimination case, you have to prove that the reason you were fired was your disability and some sort of animus towards you because of your disability. Um, when you're when you have committed misconduct, even if you can sort of relate that back to, we had, so I just literally read a case on this because I had this come up recently. There was a case about sexual harassment, and the employee accused of sexual harassment and then ultimately fired raised his autism spectrum diagnosis as a reason why he maybe didn't perceive his interactions with his female colleagues as being inappropriate.
I've seen that too. Yeah.
The court was like, yeah, no.
Yeah.
That you cannot, that's not an excuse. And even if it is an excuse, you were fired because of the inappropriate conduct with these people, not because of your diagnosis. So we also see that in alcoholism. So we have handled alcoholism disability cases. There is a difference between being fired as discrimination against someone who's an alcoholic because you didn't let them go to rehab or because you perceived them as not being able to do their job after they disclosed this struggle, but they were still doing their job appropriately. Those cases are in one category where you have a complaint. The people who come to work drunk and do something crazy at work, they're in a different category. Those people can get fired. Uh,
Yeah. And all right, you want to finish up because I want to, there's a
no,
couple other
that's
things.
that's it. Yeah.
Yeah. And to be clear, I mean, we've had successful cases involving disabilities and their impact on people in the workplace. So it's not to say for a second that you can't make those claims validly, but your point is correct. It's when you're trying to use it as really an excuse for poor behavior that, it just doesn't fly and you sort of lose credibility. Like in this
And I
situation,
thought that,
if he had gone like, 6 months ago and said he had mental health problems, it probably would have been a different story.
yeah, and I think also, and just from a threshold thing, like you can't just go to your, now maybe this is going to trigger a process, but just going to your boss and saying, I'm struggling with my mental health is not necessarily going to protect your job 10 steps down the line if you get fired and you want to bring a lawsuit, because a disability has a legal definition in the law. Being entitled to FMLA leave requires you to fall within a legal definition of a serious health condition. So you have to be, and that does hold people a little bit accountable when they try to use something like this as maybe an excuse and it's disingenuous, because you have to be treating for something, you have to be diagnosed with something, you have to be sometimes, getting medication, so it's not quite that black and white, but it just certainly makes it more difficult for the employer in navigating the situation. But if you're out on FMLA leave and your employer gets a report that while you were at work you were doing all this inappropriate stuff, you can still be fired. A lot of people think that if I'm on a protected leave or if I have a disability or I have an accommodation, nobody can fire me, and that is definitely not true.
No, and we see that all the time. We get calls for that. I would say we get multiple calls a month for those kinds of cases where someone is out on a protected leave and the employer finds something or discovers something and they get fired. And ultimately, in most cases, there's nothing you can do. All right, I want to move on from that topic unless you've got anything else. We'll revisit this to the extent more information comes along. Anything else on that before we move on?
No, I think that's everything I had. I mean, the last little employment related thing that I had jotted down was just that the assistant apparently has received a very significant, or had received a very significant raise over the last couple years. So that's something that's sort of being flagged, like was there, and that's when I think you end up kind of now in this quid pro quo situation. I don't know if he in his position would have had the authority to give someone a raise, but perhaps he had the authority to influence whether that person received a raise. Because I saw that they were very specific in some of the reporting that she had received this raise without any change in title or responsibilities. So these are like little red flags that start, going up of what's going on.
Well, it's funny you say that because I sort of use my friends and the things that they sort of like focus on as it's almost like a study group for what juries would be interested in. And in this particular situation, that's exactly the things that they were commenting on. They're like, "Huh, it seems weird that she got these huge pay raises over the last year and a half." Like those are the things that stick out to people that are major red flags. So, yeah, I think you're right. All right, so let's move on to we are in a topic because we are in the holiday season and inevitably we have holiday parties. And this year is no different than any other year where someone has gotten themselves into trouble at a holiday party. We did a podcast about this last year. We shared it recently. A friend of mine who works for a big company was texting me earlier this week because he had a holiday party, and we were sort of joking about him, following our advice from the podcast. But this case involved a big partner at a big corporate firm, Ernst and Young, in Australia, who was fired from his job where he earned $1.3 million a year, um, because he made a comment to a coworker, to the effect of, quote, "You'll be surprised, but since being single, I've probably been with more married women than single ones." Apparently, the coworker was married, didn't take kindly to that, and he was fired. The backstory being that he was on a final warning, and this, you can't make this up. He was on a final warning with the company because he had propositioned another married coworker at the 2022 Christmas party, which was, wait for it, a Miami Vice theme. So
That was my favorite
I
part of
wish I
this
could have
whole
been
thing.
there. I mean, that must have been amazing. This guy dressed like Don Johnson hitting on this woman. This must have been amazing. So
I know.
yeah, go ahead.
Well, yes, I am obsessed with the fact that it was a Miami Vice themed Christmas party. I had to like think through the fact that Australia is on an opposite seasonal schedule than us, so that made the Miami Vice theme make slightly more sense.
Yeah, that's
Because
true.
I was like, who is having a Miami Vice themed Christmas party? Um, Side note, an underappreciated movie, the one with
Yeah,
Colin Farrell.
Michael.
But yeah, I mean, this one I think we can do pretty briefly, but this just kind of goes back to like you can't do this. A lot of people get fired after holiday parties. I worked somewhere where somebody had fallen into the Christmas tree at the Fort Orange Club and like took it down. They retained their employment after that. I guess people thought that was funny, but you can certainly cross the line. Um, and get involved in these situations, and then you become a liability to your company. I mean, the guy's on a final warning, like leave these poor married women alone.
Well, it's not that different from the Michigan coach, which is, these organizations have to protect themselves. And you know, I've said this before in the show, but I often talk to people who get laid off from big corporate jobs when they're typically in their late 50s, early 60s. And inevitably they make the comment to me that they're shocked that this would have happened because they gave so much to the company. And I have to sort of like say to them, empathetically, but accurately, like, this company doesn't care. They don't care about you. They care about their profits and their bottom line, because these are publicly traded companies, or public universities that have an image to uphold. They're going to do what's best for them, and what's best for them is to get rid of someone who's harassing people and who's potentially going to cost them money in lawsuits. So it's not surprising at all that these consequences happen. Some people are surprised that this stuff still goes on, but doing what we do, it doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah, to be honest, I am surprised that the work holiday party has not become obsolete at this point. It's kind of like an antiquated thing that has survived like Me Too and all that kind of stuff, because I just feel like there's so many things that can sort of go wrong when you have people drinking a lot of alcohol and being, especially in a big company where it might be more like, you're mingling like with people that are single, or there's a big age range of people, and you get some of these like dirty old men going after like young girls when they've been drinking. Like this is just, I mean, everybody, I mean, like every woman, not that this is, it's not okay, has gone to like a holiday party and been like received some sort of caress or like weird hug that they've had to extract themselves from, and it could just go poorly.
Yeah, I mean, I had lunch recently with a friend in New York who works for, I won't identify the company because I don't want to identify them specifically, but a very large, well-known company. And he's high-level management, or I guess there would be mid-level management, but he's in a management position. And he's late 40s, and they were having their holiday party that night. And I was like, "Are you gonna go out and party?" And he's like, "Nope, I'm gonna go. I'm gonna have two drinks, and I'm gonna be on the train home by 7:30." I was like, "That's probably a good idea."
Listen,
So All right.
But I do want to say, can I just say one serious thing? Because I don't want to minimize people being
Yeah.
like groped at a holiday party, especially with what we do for a living. I do want to say that from a more serious standpoint, I think a lesson in that is that you don't know what the person who you are making like an advance towards or you're getting handsy with, you don't know what's in their background. So for me, who has been fortunate to have made it, into my mid 40s without something disgusting happening to me, is going to be able to handle a situation like that in a different way than someone who has some kind of trauma in their past. And you really don't know who you're dealing with. I just saw this whole thing unfold on social media. I don't know how this ended up in my algorithm because I've never heard of any of these people, but it was a similar situation to that where a woman is accusing someone at a work event of being groped and things like that, and this person did have sort of a history of that. Something like that triggered a lot of bad memories and things from her past, and the lesson just being that you really don't know who you're dealing with, and so you don't know if something that you might think is innocent is going to blow up into something horrible. So it's just better to, keep your wits about you in a professional atmosphere and just avoid a situation like that, blowing up into something. Because I think, sometimes people don't fully appreciate that that's how sometimes these things blow up.
Yeah, I guess that's a good segue. I was going to talk about something else, but I'll come back to it into this story, which very, very honestly, I've never heard any of these people. I don't know any of these shows, but you sent it to me, so we'll talk
Oh yeah,
about it.
I'm making you talk about reality television.
Apparently, a, I want to call her a character, a participant in the show, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives. Um, she made a claim that while shooting an overlap or a collaborative show with Vanderpump. I'm
No,
going to butcher this so bad with Vanderpump Villas,
collaborative show.
Marciano Brunette. Anyway, she claims that the guy kissed her during the shooting of the show. Okay, he is a celebrity, quote unquote. I use that term very loosely. Same with her. So she made a claim publicly that he kissed her unwantedly during the filming of the show. Apparently, these are very popular shows. I don't watch this kind of stuff, so I don't know. But long story short is that has adamantly denied it and has sued her for defamation. So this is somewhat similar to the Lively Baldoni claims, but he's basically saying the kiss was consensual. He's saying I've got text messages showing that the two of us kept in touch after this happened, and that she shared her location with me while she was traveling, etc. Now the kicker here is that she's got a family, so this has probably resulted in some significant, um, maybe unexpected consequences. I'll leave it to you at this point, but we should talk about why he might be using this defamation claim and why he might have a defense if in fact what he's saying is accurate versus what she's saying.
Yeah, so I mean, we've talked about this a lot, like you said, in the Baldoni Lively situation. His claims against her of defamation were dismissed because she had made them in the context of a legal proceeding and in a complaint in California that was in the context of sexual harassment. So California has, and I'm not sure where this lawsuit is venued, but California does have a law specifically protecting people who are making complaints of sexual harassment and assault from being sued for defamation, because that is an issue that we do see a lot as being abused, where men who have been accused credibly of sexual assault will then use defamation lawsuits to have kind of a chilling effect, especially if they have more money. And it's used kind of in an abusive way. Now, that doesn't always mean that somebody hasn't, can't use a defamation lawsuit in an appropriate way. And that's, what this guy's trying to do. So he has sued not only her, but he has also sued Hulu, which is the company that airs Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, for what we call in defamation law republication. So in defamation, you can sue not only the person who made the false claim about you or allegedly false claim about you, but you can also sue who republishes it. So that's what we see a lot in cases against newspapers and, media outlets and whatnot, because they apparently have repeated as part of her storyline on the Mormon Wives show, that has become her accusations against this guy have become sort of part of her storyline on this show. Now, his version of that, I think, is that that is intentional, that this was used as a way to maybe sensationalize her storyline or something like that. So, and I think you touched on this with the text messages. Truth is a defense to defamation. So anything that he has that might be able to demonstrate that this was a consenting situation, meaning, like you said, she continued to text him and share her location with him. I think she sent him videos of her kids. These are all things that somebody is going to rely on to show their version of the situation. Now, does it always mean that just because you were conciliatory with someone after they did something bad to you, that means it didn't happen? She has responded to that and said, I was kind of placating him and I was trying to, you know, put myself in sort of a safe situation with him. Unfortunately, these things can get ugly. I think she has also raised that she had maybe a traumatic history that might have been triggered by this event. I think we all know that something that could appear consenting on one person's part is not, maybe not consenting on the other person's part if they've, have misread the situation or there's alcohol involved and things like that. So, I mean, ultimately, these kinds of things can, shake out, but as a litigation continues, but certainly, a messy kind of situation.
Yeah. Two things. One, the case is venued in Utah, so I'm
Okay.
not quite sure what the law is there, but
Yeah, so they filmed, so she probably made the statements in
yeah, I think
Utah.
that's yeah, I think well that's where the show is filmed.
Yeah. Well,
So
I have never actually watched this show, but as our son would like me to never mention again, I have become like obsessed with these reality shows set in Utah because he wants to go to school there. And
yeah,
I
well maybe
feel,
we'll be
I feel suspicious of the dating pool in this
well
state from what I have seen.
maybe we'll learn the Utah law if we have to move there because he lives out there. But so the issue here is when you have a case like this and you're in litigation, the way it plays out, you go through depositions, you go through discovery, and there's typically a moment where one of the parties either tries to have the case dismissed or decides to go forward with a trial. And in this case, when it's a he said, she said situation, it oftentimes is not a case that will be dismissed on the law at what's called the summary judgment stage because there appears what's known as a question of fact, meaning there's an issue of factual credibility to be determined by a jury. And so a judge can't make that decision. So they basically, the court says, well, we're going to let a jury hear all the proof and decide who's telling the truth and who's lying. And so that's where these cases get really messy. And we've talked about this before. I've tried a couple of defamation cases and been involved with a handful of them over the course of my career. And I don't take them almost at all because they're very hard in these situations, and it really comes down to credibility. I think all lawsuits come down to credibility to some degree, but these cases in particular come down to, who is a jury going to look at and listen to and say this person's lying or this person's telling the truth, and that, from a lawyer's perspective, I think you've got to be really careful about trying to vet that before you bring these kinds of claims or make these kinds of claims because that's ultimately that's what determines who's going whether you're going to win or lose. So, I don't know.
Yeah, and she said that there's video potentially about this, that this happened kind of on camera, but th now they haven't been able to find this. So it does definitely seem kind of messy. I mean, one of the things that comes up in these types of cases is, are you giving an opinion or a statement of fact? Saying somebody touched me without consent is certainly a statement of fact. She also called him a sexual predator. That could potentially be framed as an opinion. We've talked about that in some cases involving like Diddy and some other people. There are some cases out there where if you kind of call someone with like hyperbole a pedophile or something like that, that the law says, that was a statement of opinion. Nobody was going to think that that was a fact. But if you couple it with actual conduct, then, I think, this sounds like a case that if it is false, would fall within the definition of defamation.
Yeah, I agree. All right, well, like all the other ones, we'll keep an eye on that one. One more before we break today. There's a couple of lawsuits that have been filed against Royal Caribbean, one in particular, and I thought this was actually interesting and not really surprising. So a 35-year-old well, the family of a 35-year-old California man who has sued Royal Caribbean after he died aboard a Royal Caribbean cruise ship last year. And the backstory is that this was one of I've never been on a cruise. So all of my information is secondhand when it comes to cruises. My understanding and what happened here is that this was an all-inclusive cruise, meaning it was an open bar. Apparently, he was served I think so. Apparently, he was served at least 33 alcoholic drinks at the ship's bar, became wildly intoxicated, had a confrontation with crew members and security, and was subdued and ultimately given administered a medication used to treat psychotic disorders and ultimately died. Um, so the allegation is that the cruise ship was negligent in continuing to serve him after he was visibly intoxicated, which we'll talk about in a minute. That the cruise line markets these packages as all you can drink, and talks about how there are nooks and cranny there are bars in every nook and cranny on the cruise ship. And then finally, the other negligence claim is that the cruise ship was negligent in its training and supervision of its and hiring of its crew members. So this brings up a couple of points as it relates to where we practice. There's a law known as the dram shop law, which specifically covers injuries caused as a result of over intoxication and over service of alcohol to visibly intoxicated people. So why don't you talk about that, and then we'll kind of touch on a couple other things.
In New York, we have the dram shop law, which is kind of a strict liability law for bars and establishments serving alcohol, which basically says if you overserve a visibly intoxicated person and they go off and get in a drunk driving accident or something like that, you're going to be liable for that. This is kind of a like interesting situation. I mean, when I first saw this reported, it was leaving out some of the fact that he had been restrained and like injected with some kind of antipsychotic drug. Because I do think that this guy went into some sort of a rampage. What happened is, my understanding is that they get on the cruise ship and he and his wife, their cabin is not ready. They had their child with them. The wife takes the child, to go explore or whatever while they're waiting for their room. This guy sits at a bar. I kind of feel the nooks and crannies is not quite as relevant to his particular situation because he went to a bar, sat there, and was served apparently 33 drinks. I mean, I don't even understand how this happens. And then went into some sort of drunken rampage where he was like running down the hallways of this cruise ship, trying to bang down doors, trying to find out where he was. He like took his shirt off at one point. So the guy is behaving very badly. The tables are going to turn, though, just like, when someone is being arrested or when someone is a prisoner. When the tables then turn to you are completely within the like physical custody of other people, like law enforcement people, at that point, you could have been behaving very poorly, but once they like have you on the ground and they have restrained you, you're now like the vulnerable person in that situation. And that to me was more compelling in terms of did they do something wrong? Because I mean, I have never heard of someone being administered like an antipsychotic drug because although I mean he's freaking out, I don't know what the
Yeah.
standard is in those types of situations. um but I think that when that all shakes out, how did this guy actually end up dying in their custody? That is like the key question. If he had been over, I think when you see this, and that was the other news story you were talking about, a woman went overboard because she was wasted on one of these things. That seems like probably a little bit more common of a context. In that situation, I think the question is going to be sort of what your comparative fault is. They can't overserve you. I don't know what the laws, sometimes cruise ships are kind of in their own little legal category.
Yeah.
Um, but in New York, you know, you can't overserve a visibly intoxicated person. Does
Yeah.
that mean
So,
they're not responsible for any of their own actions? No, but will also be responsible.
well, yeah. So New York has what's known as comparative fault. So even in a situation where someone else's negligence causes harm, if a jury is allowed to consider the relative proportion of fault between the wrongdoer and the person who was injured. And that typically comes up in like, a very simple scenario. Somebody crosses a street and is hit by a car, and it turns out that they didn't have a walk sign and they weren't paying attention. They were looking at their phone and the car, had no reason to know they were there. A jury can assess that maybe it was a 50% fault on each party. And then whatever damages the jury awards to the injured person are reduced by their comparative proportion of fault. So in a dram shop case like this, that, or a negligence case arising out of the over service of alcohol, that can be pretty significant, I would imagine, in this kind of a scenario, because yeah, they should definitely not have kept serving him, but this is the kind of thing that juries don't particularly love. It's got to be framed the right way for it to be successful, I think.
Yeah,
And
I
I
think
think
that person. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I think it would be even more so the case with somebody falling overboard. And I have to imagine that happens like relatively more often than you might think, because it seems very feasible to me that people get probably like drink way too much on these cruise ships, and it would not be surprising at all if people fall over the edge. And I
Yeah, I
assume if
mean,
you
we've
fall over the
talked
edge of a
about
cruise ship, you're gone. Like you're not coming back.
right, and we've talked about this before. I think we talked about this with when we were talking about the Tyler Skaggs situation of
Yeah.
being over prescribed or given um opioids if you have drug seeking behavior and things like that. This is kind of similar to that because it's you, the person who's sort of receiving the drugs or receiving the alcohol, to a certain extent are responsible, for your own actions. But the law does look at in negligence cases sort of what's foreseeable on the part of sort of this other entity. And I agree with you. It's certainly foreseeable that a totally drunk person can go over the edge of a cruise ship. That being said, my perception of cruises is that's basically what they are about. So there has got to be like 8 million waivers that you are signing that says, like, I understand that, falling off the side of this thing because I'm drunk, because this is an all inclusive like booze cruise sort of situation is, I'm waiving my claims against you. I do think like in this situation, even though, I do feel like you're bearing responsibility for sitting somewhere and, you're a grown man. This was like a big guy, he's having 33 drinks. I mean, that still seems kind of outrageous to me. But at the same time, like it's a little bit different than I think a maybe more similar kind of dram shop situation where maybe you're like a young woman and you're visibly wasted and they're continuing to give you shots. Like some bars won't serve shots for this reason. Like there is some responsibility to be like, this person is visibly intoxicated and I'm going to stop serving them. And then I think in this situation, you do have this extra element of did they handle this appropriately when this guy was in their custody. But yeah, I think the woman going over the side, that's tragic. But I think a jury, if it even got to that point, depending on, what kind of liability waivers there are and things like that, I think that's going to be a tough situation to try to blame, potentially on somebody else. You really have to kind of look at what the circumstances of that are. I mean, I don't know. I think you and I both, not to disparage anyone who cruises, I know that this is a popular thing to do, and I'm sure there's many fabulous, great cruises. I think you and I, for various different reasons, the whole experience it falls into like a worst nightmare category for me. So every time I hear something horrible having happening on a cruise, I'm like, well, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah, yeah. It's like a little too many people in a confined space for me, but teach his own. I will say, with respect to the dram shop, most dram shop cases in New York relate arise out of somebody who was overserved, visibly intoxicated, goes out, hurts somebody else, typically in a car. So that's the general scenario that plays out in the most often litigated cases. So this would be somewhat unusual.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that's a good point. I was going to say that too. Most of the time, it's like a totally innocent person who is sort of the victim and suing somebody. It's not necessarily the person who was overserved themselves who is suing.
okay. Anything else? I think we should wrap there.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for listening. We're going to wrap this up for this week. We'll be back again soon with another episode. We will, in upcoming weeks, be talking about AI and some of the legal implications. We'll be talking about the Luigi Mangione case, and lots of other stories in the news. Reminder, this website, or excuse me, this podcast is not legal advice. It is informational only. But if you are enjoying it, please do subscribe, share, like, follow, all of the things. And thanks for listening. We'll talk to you again soon.